Hello, everyone, and welcome to November's free monthly live stream. I'm Glen Kyle with the Northeast Georgia History Center. Very excited to be with you today about this very fascinating topic, women in World War II, especially American women in World War II. And later on, you'll see Georgia women in World War II, trying to bring this, from a larger perspective down to some local and regional history. Now, we can't go into World War II today. It's a huge conflict, but the fact that it was so vast and so all-encompassing means that every nation that was involved, at least the successful ones, were able to mobilize their entire population to fight or contribute to the war effort. And there are a few countries that were able to do that as well as the United States. Now, at the beginning of the war and in the 30s and 40s, women were not a huge part of the workforce, the industrialized workforce of the United States, and they certainly were not a part of the U.S. military. Those were two realms that were still very much the domain of men for all the reasons that you can imagine that we probably don't need to go into. But war changes things. There's something about conflict, and the bigger the conflict, the bigger the national conflict, the bigger the changes that those conflicts make on the societies which undertake that war. And World War II being the largest conflict the United States has ever been involved in means that those changes that come out of the war are also going to be some of the biggest that we as a nation have ever experienced, especially in so short an amount of time comparatively. Now, women, of course, make up at least half the population, depending upon what year we're looking at. Sometimes it's, 50.8% of the population. We're about half and half, though. And a lot of the reasons that women were not involved in industrial work in the military is because it was considered not the realm of women, right? We are still sort of just coming out of the cult of domesticity in this time period. Women's role, and this is an important role. I don't want to make this sound like some sort of pejorative. Women's role had traditionally been in the home, raising the family, taking care of the home, and supporting the husband in the work that they do. Again, that was an important role that women played throughout most of world history, and it's something to consider the importance of that. We shouldn't think of women's roles as somehow lesser or demeaning because of the incredibly central work they do to bring us into this world and keep us all alive and fed and healthy. But that means that those incredibly labor-intensive and time-intensive jobs made it so that women could not participate fully in the rest of society the way men could. And even as early as 1900s, this was slowly starting to change. Women were beginning to feel that there was more time available, that they could contribute in more significant ways to larger cultures and larger societies, larger businesses. This comes along, of course, along with the civil rights movement and the early civil rights movement when the Civil War ended slavery. There's a huge movement to give the vote and give equal rights to everyone. Unfortunately, that does not come along to women really until the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment comes after World War I. And in World War I, it was just a taste of what women were able to contribute to a major war effort and to contribute to American society. But what happened in World War I was just a fraction of what happens in the Second World War. But women do get the right to vote. And along with that right to vote, coupled with a lot of new technologies, electricity, and labor-saving devices in the home, mean that women have free time, and they have the franchise in government, and they're going to start playing a larger and larger role, but there are still a lot of barriers they have to face. Remember when I said that war brings about these social changes? Well, war, especially one as big as World War II, starts to break down those walls and shatter those glass ceilings, because the bottom line is, when we get involved in World War II, remember, we don't know if we're going to win. We are fighting against some of the most powerful, militaristic, successful nations on earth. And a lot of other countries don't even think about mobilizing their women at first. But once America gets involved in the war, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it's very obvious that we are going to have the entire country come into play. Now, it's interesting, although America becomes the arsenal of democracy, that's because we have a huge industrial base and we can make a lot of stuff. As I said, most of those jobs are held by men. Well, when the war starts, we need men to go into the military. to be the infantrymen, the supply guys, the tankers, the pilots, the sailors on the ships. We need millions and millions of men to go into the Army. But we still need to keep that industrial base going, which means that we're going to start looking for workers. And there's not a lot of hesitation in the United States when it comes to letting women come in. There's some. We're not really sure at the time if women can physically do the work. There are some folks who think that women aren't mentally capable of doing this manufacturing work and this types of jobs. But surprise, surprise, as women slowly and then increasingly go into those roles, turns out that they can do them pretty well, especially with modern technologies, and especially something begins to be noticed by people, begins to be noticed by scientists and what we call now human resources people and production specialists. They start to see that women have a lot of skills and attention to detail and ability to focus, generally speaking, that men don't have. And so women turn out to be great inspectors when it comes to doing jobs on tanks or engines or ships that require a lot of detail work. Women turn out to be really good at that. And once they figure that out, they start actively recruiting women. And it's very interesting because women go from only having those traditional women's roles, secretaries, phone operators, cleaning, teachers, things like that. I've about listed all of them. Seamstresses, maybe storekeepers, storefront ladies. And all of a sudden, because the factories need this work done, they start opening up these help wanted ads, and women go in by the thousands, the hundreds of thousands, and the millions, right? During World War II, we're not even sure exactly how the numbers work, but the numbers are about anywhere from 3 to 6 million women go into the war workforce. I'm not even talking about the military. I'll come to that in a second. But these women are going into jobs. This is a huge chunk of the American female population. They're being called upon to do things that they've never done before. This means that they have new experiences and new opportunities. For the first time, they're sort of in charge of the home. If their husband has gone off to war, has joined the military, or even their brothers or their older sons, suddenly their role at home becomes much more part of the authority of the home and much more organizational and logistical, making the home run. And they're being asked to go into the workplace and build tanks and trucks and jeeps and airplanes and aircraft carriers and things like that. So they're having to go out and work, and they're getting something, therefore, that they've never, as a huge group, gotten before, an income and sort of the final say in how the home runs. This means that they're experiencing a lot of activities and opportunities and challenges that women had never had before in American society, not quite to this level. And again, it turns out that most of them rise to the challenge and are able to do this, not just at home, but in the workplace. With this newfound independence, this newfound authority, they began to run their own lives, and they are beginning to feel like they are part of the nation, they are part of something larger than themselves, and they are contributing in very meaningful ways. And they have their own money, they have to manage that, they're having to manage the home. These opportunities rapidly begin to alter the way women see themselves and see their respective gender across the board. And the nation realizes this, and much of the propaganda, the posters, the recruitment, the enthusiasm comes from women. And remember, women are behind this war effort as much as anyone else because they're politically engaged now, or at least they have the opportunity to become politically engaged. Now, as the war goes on and they realize that America's real power in the world is the ability to produce materiel, that means that they're really the force of victory. And as America goes through the war and approaches victory and achieves victory, it becomes obvious to everyone involved that women have played no small role in that. As a matter of fact, we probably couldn't have done what we did without them. Even the enemy, Albert Speer, who was in charge of German war production, they did not mobilize their women until very, very late in the war, until really about the last 6 months of the war. And after the war, the guy who's in charge of German war production and has therefore also sort of studied American war production techniques, comes out and says himself, in effect, that the fact that you mobilized your women is what made you win. If we had done that, we would have done great, but we were too slow because we were caught up in traditional roles of men and women. You were able to go beyond that, and as a result of your ability to change quickly, you were able to achieve victory at a much more rapid pace. That's fairly high praise and fairly great insight. And so women after the war have gotten this taste of independence, but there's a problem. The men, now that the war's over, are starting to leave the military by the millions, and they're starting to come home. They want their wives there to kind of go. They want things to go back to normal. The men who served in the military want things to go back to normal. That's part of what they were fighting for. That means they want to come home. They want their moms to cook them dinner when they move out and they get married. They want their wives to cook them dinner and take care of the kids. Well, enough women have experienced this different life that you have this change in perception that is simply not going to go back to the way things were. These women are having to give up roles in industry for the men coming back to get their jobs, and this creates a real conflict and a real sort of friction on a grand sense between women's roles in society, between the men coming back, and on even more personal roles. There are several accounts of men coming back and women having to leave their job at the aircraft factory and go back home, that none of them feel like this is the way things should be. It's not what it was before the war started. What they're coming home to has changed irrevocably, and it's not going to go back to the way it was. Now, millions of those women were forced or chose to leave the workplace, the war industries that have been going on, and went back into the home. But as I said, enough of them. There was a critical mass of women that were able to have experienced that began to agitate for more things. They want to go to college. They want to have jobs that are other than just secretarial and administrative and things like that. They want to participate in society to the extent that their talents and abilities will carry them. And that's really part of the crux of this, is that men had always been able to exercise their talents and abilities and to succeed using those. Women had not had that opportunity before, not in large amounts. And so what you see really is an acknowledgement of a wider society of those talents and abilities, and women wanting to exercise that more. And so moving into the post-war era, you get a lot of women who begin to agitate for things politically, socially, moving all the way up to the present day, right? It's a very slow change, but all those changes happen because of World War II. Now, I mentioned men coming back from the military. It's important to remember that women joined the military as well. As I said, the United States, millions of men are going to the military, but compared to some of the other nations, believe it or not, our population was not as large. And we were having to put workers into our huge industrial base and maintain that. Plus, we were having to fight a massive war in Europe, plus a massive war in the Pacific. We're fighting a two-front war. We have the largest industrial capacity on the planet, and we have to feed all of that, and that takes people. That takes labor, which means that women, of course, are called into the workplace. We need a lot of Rosies, but we also need a lot of women to help man the military, right? So much of the military is now needed for fighting positions, for infantry, for pilots, on submarines and things like that. Jobs that they're still not quite going to let women do at this point. But a woman can take a job that will free up a man to go and be an infantryman or a tanker or a bomber pilot or something like that. And so about, depending on what numbers you look at, about 400,000 women joined the military during World War II in one form or another. And there's lots of ways that they do that. There are, and the Army is the first to do this. The WACs, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which eventually the auxiliary gets taken out and it becomes the Women's Army Corps. And tens of thousands of women join the Army. They go through a form of basic training. They get uniforms. It's very disciplined. They have to fall in the morning. There's reveille, all the things. They're in the military. And the WAVs, the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, they are the Navy. And tens of thousands of women join the Navy. The SPARs join the Coast Guard. The WASP, Women's Auxiliary Service Pilots. I'll come back to them in a second. They basically are trained pilots to fly aircraft around. The United States Marine Corps Women's Auxiliary or Women's Reserve, women join the Marine Corps, and they're doing all these different jobs. Now, because the military they need women now. They don't just want women to join. They do, but they need women to join. And so they begin recruiting, saying our service is the best. And it's sort of interesting. The Navy takes an interesting approach to recruit women. The Navy hires a clothing designer, Man Boucher, to design the women's Navy uniforms. And when you look at these, they are very different than any other military uniform. The other military uniforms are basically men's versions with a different hat and a skirt instead of trousers. But the Navy uniforms that the women have, the WAVs, they are very slick. And this has a lot of women say, well, if I'm going to have to, join the military, I kind of want to look good, and I'm going to go with the one that looks the best. And this was a very interesting dynamic that goes on in the Second World War, is that women were expected to go into the factory, to get their hands dirty, to break their nails, join the military, march around, and yet there was this expectation that they should still look pretty doing it. And a lot of them embraced that wholeheartedly, and they went to great lengths to make themselves, to still maintain their femininity, I guess you could say. And you can tell in a lot of these pictures, they get very frustrated. They're writing home that the uniforms they get when they're at the front, they're just men's uniforms, and they haven't designed anything for women because they haven't had time. And so they're wearing men's clothing, and they're having to belt them really tight and roll the sleeves way up and roll the cuffs way up on their pants because they don't fit. But eventually they do get women's uniforms. But women serve not directly on the front lines, but they do serve in the military in very important ways. And some of those are nurses. The Army has about 60,000 nurses that served during the war overseas, and the Navy has about 14,000 nurses. And of all the women who served in the military, as I said, there were about 400,000, about 800 die in the line of duty, right? So these are women that are close enough to the front, or their ship gets torpedoed or something like that. So women do sacrifice and give up their lives for freedom and to maintain the American way of life. That's something that should be remembered. There was one section, though, of women during the war in the military that's a rather unfortunate story, but with a happy ending. So these are the WASP, the Women Air Service Pilots. And the industry, the Air Force, the Army Air Force, needed pilots to move airplanes around to different bases. Right, the factories make the airplanes, but they need to get the airplanes to a certain airfield or something. They can't just put them all on a railroad. But the military also needs its male pilots to go fly bombers and transport planes and fighters. Where are we going to get the people to fill in that gap? Well, they go to women. And this is actually, women see this as a phenomenal opportunity, right? If you join the Women Air Service Pilots, they're going to train you to be a pilot, a female pilot. They're going to do everything, and you get to fly all the latest military aircraft. Problem is, this was sort of on a contract basis. The WASP were not officially part of the U.S. military, which means they received no benefits, which means they received no life insurance. And this is one of the sad things. When people fly airplanes and they're in there enough hours, accidents are going to happen. And so there are instances of WASP whose plane crashes and they die in the line of service, but they're not military. So the military doesn't even pay their funeral expenses. They don't have any life insurance. So the other WASP are having to take up collections to pay for the funeral expenses of this pilot, and that's horrible. And it wasn't until I think it was the 1990s that the WASP were actually retroactively granted full veteran status by the U.S. government, and they became eligible for retirement and VA benefits and things like that. But they're So not all the women who served in a military capacity actually joined the military. And there are all sorts of fascinating and remarkable stories from all these millions of women in the American states who underwent the experience of the war and who it changed them forever. And bringing that home a little bit, of course, thousands of women from Georgia served in the military, served in the home front, worked in the factories, or even as young ladies growing up would contribute to the war effort at home. Or women who stayed home and did hold that home life together, right? This, I'll give you this story before we move on to some of our fantastic interviews. My own family. My grandfather and my grandmother, both, of course, were alive in World War II, and it was an interesting situation. 3 brothers married 2 sisters and a cousin up in what's now or is Fannin County, Georgia, around McKaysville and areas like that. Well, the war comes. They're living through the Depression. They're dirt poor, but the war comes and they have an opportunity to go work at the Bell Bomber plant in Marietta. And so they all decide, they all get together and like, you know what, that's where the work is. Let's all go down there. And so they all go down there and they all apply for a job and get it at the Bell Bomber plant, except for my grandmother. My grandmother, it's decided, is the one who's going to stay home and cook meals all day and take care of everyone else's kids, right? So my two great aunts and my grandfather and 2 great uncles go build bombers, while my grandmother stays home and does all the domestic stuff. Personally, I think that makes her almost as much of a Rosie as anyone else. They couldn't have done their job if it hadn't been someone there on the home front, keeping things going, working with all the issues of rationing that were going on, trying to feed their family, clothe their family. It's a remarkable experience that I think we forget about. When we think about World War II, we think about the big battles, we think about the big experiences, the big conflict, but sometimes we forget that all those were people. And all those people have very interesting, different stories that contribute to the larger national narrative, and it's worth remembering that. So what we have up next for you is some great interviews that I conducted, about 15, 18 years ago with some remarkable women from the state of Georgia who served in the military, who served in the home front, who built bombers, who grew up as young ladies during the war, might have fallen in love, might have gotten their hearts broken. But I hope you're going to enjoy this look from their own words of what it was like to be a woman during World War II.
I was at a party. There were about 4 couples, and somebody, for some reason or other, turned on the radio, and we heard about Pearl Harbor. And I remember one man just dropped his glass, and we just stood there. We didn't talk. And though we knew deep down that the war was coming and that we would have to go into it, we never really faced it until Pearl Harbor. We didn't question it. It was very interesting. Everybody was ready to go, ready to volunteer. There was no question in our mind that we were going to war.
We were gung-ho patriotic about everything and whole hog against what they had done and wanting to win that war badly. The number of people that was stationed here from other areas grew tremendously. Mother would invite a few of them to home-cooked meal. So we met a large number of the servicemen. So I fell in love with more than one of them.
Oh, we wrote letters, and our family were good about, most families were very good about writing letters. Mail call was very important in those days. We were so glad to hear from home. So that was a big time of the day to receive mail from family and friends.
We went to the officers' club, wrote letters, and we'd always go into the city and watch the newsreels because that was the only pictures we had of the war because, we didn't have TV then.
So here's a plan that's fair and square. Everybody gets their share. No more griping anywhere. Get the point, Mrs. Brown.
Rationing was
It was a part of our war effort, and we were glad we could do it.
This was a necessary part of winning the war, and we were all a part of the effort.
That's what a rationing plan is for, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Jones.
I learned to drink coffee without sugar. And things that, of course, some small things sound like, but we did our best to do everything we could.
Many things were rationing, and food, the one that we paid most attention to. Tires were rationed, shoes were rationed. We could only buy one or at most 2 pairs of leather shoes per year. Some types of clothing were rationed. Nylon hose, for example, were non-existent. Gasoline was rationed. You would get a booklet with coupons in it that was designed to last a specific amount of time. The most popular was the A coupon, and as I recall, that was less than 5 gallons a week, which not do in this day and age.
We saved things like tin cans. It was long before the days of recycling, but they were used in the war effort. And we children saved tin foil from things like chewing gum wrappers. We all thought it was necessary, and that we were all, I was a child, but we were all part of the war effort.
Our property was 3 acres, and the back third of the property was devoted to a victory garden and a fruit orchard. We grew lima beans, string beans, squash, okra, the traditional southern vegetables that we depend on so much in this area.
It's the only time Mother ever did this, and we did it together, and we children worked with her. It was a formative time, and a never-to-be-forgotten time. Atlanta was, we thought it was big, but it was a much smaller city then. The Bell Bomber plant made for great growth of this town, bringing all these people to work in the Bell Bomber plant, as well as the military people who came to town. And it grew tremendously. It made it into a major city.
After Pearl Harbor, I came from Columbus to Atlanta and went to work for Bell Aircraft. We were all very proud of it, very, that we were doing our part.
I have never in all my life seen as much as patriotism exhibited as I did during this war effort.
Our organization was called, you may have heard of it, the WAAC, the Women Army Auxiliary Corps. See, before I went in, I worked in a laundry. I wanted to sign up because that's not the type of work that I wanted to do all of my life.
I convinced the family that that was what I was going to do. I'd taught school 4 years, I was an adult, and I was going to join the Army. Right away, we started being real officers and soldiers. The men didn't particularly like being replaced and sent overseas, but we were able to hold down jobs that would release more men for active duty in either in Europe or the Pacific. So we were glad to be there helping out.
I joined Red Cross. And I joined Red Cross rather than the WWII or the Waves because my brother had been inducted for over a year. He went a year before Pearl Harbor. And I knew my mother couldn't take another child going overseas. And so I joined Red Cross. I still can remember so vividly the Battle of the Bulge. We were told that they were going to bring men right from the battlefield to our hospital. And these men were so dazed, so out of it, they didn't know what had happened. They were shipped right from the battlefield into ambulances, into a plane, and then into our hospital. And we had to work with them to show them that it wasn't a crime, it wasn't a shame to break down, that strong men did it. And that if you awoke in a foxhole, like one man told me, with all your companions dead but you, it would have been very difficult not to go into shock. To me, I learned an awful lot about treating mental patients, which helped me in my future career.
World War II gave me the opportunity to move up in life, because if not, I would have still been at home just doing just ordinary manual work.
It just is indescribable how people felt. Uniforms were all over their place, civilians. It was one big avenue of joy, that's all I can say, and happiness.
I can remember everybody was so happy, but particularly men and women who were in service, we were just jumping.
Oh, it was very exciting, very thrilling. It was just such a happy day, and we knew that was it. I hated what they had to do at the end with the bombing and all, but that it just seemed that was what they had to do to make the world safe.
Well, one thing I think you have to remember is that you live for the present, live in the present, think of the future, but you can't forget the past. Because if you forget the past, it's going to be repeated, as has been said. But they have to know that you mobilize for danger and evil, that evil has to be destroyed in any form.
Women have always struggled to make a role for themselves, but the women in World War II showed that it could be done, that they could perform essential work, they could perform the same work. They have a brain that they can use, and it cut the ropes that detained women for later years.
So I can tell you, folks, that being able to conduct those interviews and meet those remarkable women was a true honor, and it was one of the greatest professional experiences I've ever had. I hope you enjoyed learning from those women. I hope you've enjoyed this special presentation on women in World War II, and I hope it encourages you to do more research. If you have someone in your family who is still alive, who served then, go talk to them, even if they didn't serve in the military. You're going to get some remarkable stories. There's lots of great books. There's lots of great websites. And remember, 50% of the American population did contribute to the war effort. It wasn't just all the GIs. It was the Rosies, too. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed this. If you enjoy this program, there's lots of opportunity to see more if you become a member. If you become a member, you'll not only get into the museum at no cost whenever you come by, but you'll have access to a weekly members-only program that we have here at the History Center on YouTube and on Facebook. So please consider becoming a member. But even if you're not a member, please tell everyone you know about our great programs. We want to make sure we get this information out to everyone. So until we see you again, stay safe, take care, and learn about history.
There goes one of those petticoat soldiers now.
Yeah. My sister wants to join the WWII. What do you think of that?
She's crazy. What the devil's a woman want to be a soldier for?
Just a waste of time. This is a man's war. What sort of jobs can they do?
What sort of jobs can we do? Take a look, mister. X-ray technicians, inspectors of Army meat, teachers schooling our soldiers, WWII or classification experts, assignment interviewers.
So this is a man's war, is it? WWII are at work on every sort of Army vehicle, doing every sort of motor transport job, testing walkie-talkies, testing radio tubes. Those are just a few of the jobs they do. There are 239 more. Hey, you two armchair generals on the porch, here's something more for you to think about. Listen.
General Eisenhower said,
In many jobs, WWIIs do the work of two men. The Army needs and can use all it can get.
And listen to the women of the United Nations. They too have some ideas on the subject. The English with their calm courage, the stalwart women of heroic Russia, the Canadian and Australian women, the women of China with their undying fortitude, and tens of thousands of American WWIIs. What are their ideas on the subject? Listen.
We shall live up to the legends of our fighting